So today our subject is labor and capital, and I'm going to begin our discussion. So to my mind, there are three great themes in the composition of a progressive alternative in political economy. And they are precisely the ones that we have addressed in the preceding weeks of the course. The relation of the backward to the advanced parts of production, and thus the theme of an insular or inclusive knowledge economy. The relation of finance to the real economy or to production, and the relation of labor to capital. A position on these three themes should, to my mind, form the heart of a progressive position in political economy. And it has to be complemented then by certain other themes that transcend the economic realm. One of those is the reorganization of democratic politics in the direction of a high-energy democracy that no longer needs crisis to make change possible. The reorientation of education along lines that we briefly discussed earlier in the course, and the organization of civil society outside the state and outside the market, because only an organized civil society can generate alternatives and act on them. So there you have altogether 6 themes that represent, as it were, the skeleton, the basic framework of a structural alternative. A structural alternative to neoliberalism on one side, to institutionally conservative social democracy or social liberalism on the other side, and to the populist attempt to profit from the vacuum produced by the failures of both institutionally conservative social democracy and neoliberalism. The subject today then is one of these themes of a progressive political economy, labor and capital. And a starting point for the discussion might be the observation of a momentous historical change. The momentous historical change is the collapse of the world of industrial mass production, a world in which a significant part of the labor force was assembled in stable jobs in large productive units under the aegis of large business enterprises. That world was the basis of good jobs in the middle parts of the job structure. And it was the basis as well of what could be described as a broad social compact or social contract that reconciled economic growth with the provision of antidotes to economic insecurity and economic inequality. It's that world that has disintegrated. And all the problems, or many of the problems with which we've been dealing and with which contemporary politics now deals, have to do with the sequel of that failure, of that collapse. Now, with respect to the particular theme of labor and capital, we now find established in the world 2 main discourses. Both of them seem to be radically inadequate. One discourse is the neoliberal discourse, which, with respect to labor, preaches radical flexibility, the flexibilization of labor markets. And we know that flexibility has operated as a euphemism for radical economic insecurity. On the other hand, we have the discourse of the traditional leadership of the union movement and of the left-leaning parties, a syndicalist discourse which defends the traditional forms of labor organization, and especially collective bargaining, in favor of the workers who are headquartered or who used to be headquartered in the capital-intensive parts of the economy. Now, what has happened is that all over the world, unionization has shrunk. Together with this disintegration of its major productive base in industrial mass production. The United States is an extreme, but nevertheless characteristic case. Unionization in the United States is now something like 11 or 12%, and the majority of that are employees of the government, or else in quasi-state situations such as graduate students in universities. The union movement in the private economy has shrunk dramatically. That's the objective situation. And in that context, this traditional syndicalist discourse ends up being a defense of the interests of the organized minority of workers, often against the interests or to the detriment of the interests of the disorganized majority. So these two discourses seem to be inadequate, failed attempts to address the problems that result from the disintegration of industrial mass production and the sinking of the middle part of the job structure. That's the basis. Now, in the outline of my programmatic discussion, I want to distinguish our response in the short term to this crisis and to the social and economic emergency that it produces, and the long-term direction to which we might aspire in reshaping the relations between labor and capital. And with respect to the short term, we have to then distinguish the problems of the organized labor force, now a minority, a shrinking minority, and the problems of the disorganized majority of workers in developing as well as in rich countries. So I begin then with this first problem of how to address the alternatives for the organized minority. There are two main labor law regimes developed in the course of the 20th century. One of them, by far the predominant one, is the collective bargaining system. The collective bargaining system, which you have in the United States, arises in law as a response to radical inequality of bargaining power in the employment relation. So the basic idea animating this framework is that in the employment relation, the inequality of bargaining power between employers and employees is so stark that unless some form of countervailing power is produced in favor of the workers, the scheme of contract will be a sham, obscuring the reality of power or economic duress. And thus the workers are to be organized so that once organized, they can reestablish something equivalent to contract, collective contract. That's the spirit of the collective bargaining system. And the collective bargaining system is then ultimately based on two fundamental principles. The first principle is that the decision to organize or to unionize is purely voluntary. The workers decide whether they want to unionize or not. And the second principle is that the union movement is entirely independent from the state, from the government. It represents the interests of the workers and is in no sense under the tutelage of the apparatus of the state. This is, however, not the only way of organizing labor in the 20th century. There was an alternative. And the alternative was first designed under very suspect circumstances in the Carta del Lavoro of 1927 in Mussolini's Italy. And it is, we can label it the corporativist system as opposed to the contractualist regime. It no longer exists in Italy, but it migrated to Latin America. And in Latin America, it was relabeled and reinvented as an instrument of the left-leaning nationalist populist regimes of Cardenas in Mexico, of Perón in Argentina, and of Vargas in Brazil. The corporativist system became then, in those Latin American regimes, an instrument of what the political scientists and sociologists would describe as controlled mass mobilization. The state in those countries was embarked on a program of import substituting industrialization, and it needed to create its own base, its own constituency for that project. And this corporativist labor law regime was one of the main means for organizing that constituency. Now, the corporativist system is then based also on two basic principles, which are the opposite, the reverse of the principles underlying the contractualist regime. The first is that everyone in principle in the economy is automatically unionized. Everyone who has a job in the formal economy is unionized according to their sector of production. And then there's a pyramid going up, a combination of a sectoral and territorial principles, so they're state by state in federations, and sector by sector, there's a unitary union system. And the second principle animating the corporatist regime is that the labor movement is under the guidance or influence or tutelage of the state, typically exercised through a Ministry of Labor, because it is an attempt at controlled mass mobilization. Now, it might seem that there's no case for this corporatist regime with its roots in a long past fascist regime. But there is a case. And the case is that the contractualist regime suffers from what you might regard as three great defects when compared to its corporativist alternative. The first defect is that it focuses the energy or militancy of the workers on the decision whether to unionize. By contrast, under the corporativist regime, the fact of unionization, of organization, is a gift of the law. Everyone is automatically unionized. And therefore, the focus of energy shifts from the decision whether to unionize or not to what to do with this power which the law grants to the workers. The second defect of the contractualist regime is that in a hierarchically segmented production system, in which some parts of the economy are capital intensive and advanced, Others are labor-intensive and backward. The tendency of the contractualist regime is to echo and amplify the underlying inequalities of the production system. The workers and their employers in those capital-intensive businesses have common interests. The wage bill may be a relatively minor part of the wage cost of the enterprise. And they have common interests against everyone else in the economy, all the other workers who are stuck in less advanced parts of the production system. By contrast, you could say the corporativist system maintains a solidaristic tilt to the labor movement. And third, the tendency of the contractualist system is to privilege the purely economic aspirations of the workers to wages and benefits. Whereas the corporativist regime, which, with its much broader scope of inclusion, tends to shift the focus to a larger institutional and political agenda of the workers. Nevertheless, the corporatist regime suffers from an obvious and massive defect with its subordination of the workers to the state. And thus there arises naturally the idea of a third solution, which is simply a hybrid of those two regimes. The third solution is to design a system that, like the corporatist regime, automatically unionizes everyone who has a formal job, but assures workers and the union movement a complete independence from the state. So in other words, the union structure is a structure parallel to the state, but independent of the state. There are different movements within this unitary union structure, and they compete for position in that structure in the form of federations and confederations of workers, just as political parties compete for position in the unitary structure of the state. So it's as if it were a parallel democracy, a form of industrial democracy, separate from the state. Now, what could one say about the practical applicability of this alternative, which I've just described as the hybrid regime? On the one hand, you might say that it has come too late. It has come too late because the underlying reality of industrial mass production no longer exists. So you might deride it as a solution for a world that no longer exists. But on the other hand, it might be that this hybrid regime, by its dynamic of organizing everyone and giving a solidaristic tilt to the labor movement, has a function that goes beyond the organized part of the economy and could be relevant to the problems that we'll discuss of the disorganized majority. It is therefore an open question what the scope of the pertinence of this hybrid regime is. Now let's turn to the second part of this problem. The second part then is the situation of the disorganized majority in both the developing countries and the rich ones. And here it seems quite obvious that both those discourses, those predominant contemporary discourses, neoliberalism with its preaching of flexibility and the traditional syndicalist position of defending collective bargaining, are completely inadequate. They're just non-responsive to this new reality. The reality is that in the formal economy, an increasing part of the labor force is abandoned to some form of unstable, precarious, or temporary employment. A precariat, as it's sometimes called, by contrast to the proletariat. And of course, in many countries, the majority of workers aren't even in the formal economy at all. They're in the informal economy. So, for example, in Brazil, it's about half of the workers are in the informal economy. They don't have formal jobs. They're not under the protection of the law at all. And in India, it's something like 90% of the workers who are so-called non-registered workers, not in the formal economy. So, to take the intermediate example of Brazil, if you add the 50% who are in the informal economy to the increasing portion in the informal economy, to the increasing portion of workers in the formal economy who are in precarious employment, it's the vast majority of the labor force. So we need a legal regime that responds to that new reality. We can't simply have the 20th century solution, collective bargaining, countervailing power, to the 21st century problem. We need to master the new realities of production. That's the argument. And therefore we would need, alongside the established legal regime, which in most countries is some version of collective bargaining, a second legal regime that would address the situation of the precarious, unstable workers caught in the secondary part of the labor market. Now, you could imagine the general character of the solution as a kind of sliding scale. So you should say, these workers who are not organized should be organized. New forms of organization, taking advantage of the new technologies of communication to that end. But to the extent that they are not organized, to the extent that they remain unorganized, there should be direct legal intervention in the employment relation. And the object, the end of this direct legal intervention in the employment relation should be to distinguish legitimate or inevitable flexibility, the residual core of legitimacy in the neoliberal idea, from illegitimate insecurity. So the position of the syndicalist orthodoxy is that all attempts to work outside the framework of collective bargaining by temporary contracts, for example, or subcontracting, should be regarded as a fraudulent circumvention of the labor laws. But you could say, by opposition to that idea, that it is impossible by decree to outlaw the new realities of production. This is a new reality. It's organizing on what I described as a global scale, a new putting out system, the organization of work and production through decentralized contractual arrangements. And we can't simply propose to outlaw it. We have to master it. And if we don't master it, we allow the legitimate aim of flexibility to degenerate into the illegitimate result of the cheapening of labor. And the cheapening of labor, the downward tilt to the returns to labor, is inimical to a dynamic of socially inclusive rise in productivity, which is essential to economic growth. So it is economically as well as socially regressive. So an example of this direct legal intervention in the employment relation would be to insist on a principle of price neutrality, as I described it in an earlier class. Work rendered under conditions of temporary or unstable employment should be remunerated at levels comparable to the remuneration of the same labor given under conditions of stable employment. And of course, there are many technical problems, technical legal problems, that would arise in the working out of this principle. But the general objective is clear. The general objective is to distinguish flexibility from insecurity and from the result of the cheapening of labor through the creation of a new body of law. And you can even imagine this legal regime that I'm imagining for the unstable workers as coexisting with the other principle of the hybrid labor law regime that I described before. And the two together would work to contain and master the consequences of this fateful change in the realities of production. Now, so much for the short-term consequences of the shift in production. Now I want to say a word about the long-term direction. And in the long-term direction, there are three principles or three aims to distinguish, all of which we have addressed in one form or another earlier in the course. So first has to do with technology and the relation of technology to labor. We should not treat technology as an exogenous force with an irresistible logic of its own. It can be the object of deliberate shaping or intervention. It is our creation. We can determine its direction. And over time, we should, in general, prefer an evolution of technology that enhances labor to an evolution of technology that simply replaces labor. So, of course, some technologies will inevitably replace labor. But the question is whether, in addition to this inevitable replacement, substitution of labor by machines, there will also be this virtuous combination, this partnership between the machine and the worker. On the principle that I described before, the machine does everything that we've learned how to repeat so that we can do the not yet repeatable. And the combination of the worker with the machine is much more powerful than the worker or the machine alone. In this economy, in this democratized market order of the future, the worker no longer works as if he were one of his machines, as he did in Adam Smith's pin factory or Henry Ford's assembly line. He works as an anti-machine with his machine. And no human being then will be condemned to do the work that a machine could do. So work ceases to have a formulaic or merely repetitious character. And thus this is a profound aspiration because it's connected with the idea that we can hope to achieve freedom in the economy and not just freedom from the economy through the overcoming of scarcity. Now, the second principle defining the long-term direction has to do with the nature of free work, of free labor. A democratized market economy should be based on free labor. But what is free labor? There are three forms of free labor, three basic forms. One is wage labor, economically dependent wage labor, which Karl Marx regarded as the most salient characteristic of what he described as capitalism. The worker is required to sell his labor. But there are two other principles: self-employment and cooperation. and in principle the possibility that those two other principles could be related to each other. The self-employed producers or workers cooperate. Now, it's very interesting that it was only at the end of the 19th century, relatively recently, that the absolute predominance of wage labor as the form of free labor began to seem natural or inevitable. Up to the end of the 19th century, the overwhelming consensus of liberals as well as socialists was that economically dependent wage labor was a transitory and defective form of free work, retaining the characteristics of serfdom and slavery. And this was the position that all the liberals took, John Stuart Mill as well as Karl Marx. It is classically formulated in Abraham Lincoln's address to the Wisconsin Agricultural Society a few years before the Civil War. But there was a problem that the liberals and socialists of the 19th century never managed to solve. And the problem was how to reconcile this predominance of self-employment and cooperation with the relentless imperative of the aggregation of resources at scale in a complex modern economy. And so the solution to this problem, which they were never able to provide, then requires innovation in a third principle of this long-term direction, which is the reshaping of the terms on which the producers have access, have decentralized, democratized access to the means of production. And it is in that context that I then invoke the idea of a capital auction. So we think property, a market economy has no single natural and necessary legal form. Property is a bundle of relations that can be disaggregated and vested in different right holders. And there is no necessary relation. In fact, there is a contradiction between the market understood as decentralization of economic initiative and the market understood as absolute control and perpetual control by those decentralized agents over the resources at their command. These two dimensions of the market idea do not go naturally together. In fact, they're in tension with each other. And we can hope to extend the degree of absolute decentralization by imposing limits on the absoluteness of the control. That's the central idea. So these three things that I've described as elements in the long-term direction complement one another. So that evolution of technology to enhance labor rather than replace it is unlikely to occur so long as economically dependent wage labor remains as the predominant form of free work, because the wage labor gives to management, gives to the owner, a general managerial discretion to organize labor on a quasi-military basis. And this is a faculty which it would be very hard for the capitalists, the so-called capitalists, to abdicate. On the other hand, the substitution of economically dependent wage labor by a combination of self-employment and cooperation is feasible only if accompanied by innovation in the property regime. Thus, the three elements of the long-term direction in some way converge. Now, of course, this discussion, this second part of my discussion, focused on the long-term direction, is predictably the part that is furthest away from contemporary discussion. But in dealing with the emergency problem, the immediate problem of precarious labor, and the consignment of a major part of the labor force to radical insecurity, it is necessary to have in mind the ultimate direction that we want to seek. No wind helps us if we don't know to what port we're sailing, and we must always have in mind the purpose. As Nietzsche said, the forgetting of the purpose is the basic form of stupidity. So, there. Yes.
I was actually going to ask about how, so there's this phenomenon of precarious employment.
Yes.
How did it emerge, and actually, like, to what degree globalization actually has to do with?
Well, so we should go back to the discussion of the insular knowledge economy, right? So the nature of the advanced practice of the most advanced practice of production changes. It used to be mass production, so-called Fordist mass production. Now it is becoming this knowledge economy. Now, you might have expected the knowledge economy to spread, and indeed it does exist in every sector of production. However, in each sector, it remains an exclusive fringe. And instead of spreading, it has done the opposite. It has withdrawn because the masters of this insular form of the knowledge economy have found a way to bifurcate their process of production. The creative, profitable, and fun part they keep for themselves. The routinized and formulaic part they subcontract to workers and enterprises in other parts of the world, often under these very unstable contractual arrangements. That's what I call the new putting out system. So it's this putting out system on a global scale, and one of its characteristic consequences has been the consignment of an increasing part of the labor force to precarious employment. So some of these enterprises in the core, in the intimate core of the knowledge economy, don't even have a physical apparatus. They're so-called fabless. They have no factories. And so what they want is to externalize the labor costs through various forms of subcontracting or temporary employment, and to travel light. That's what's happened. So this is the socially perverse form of the knowledge economy that has come to prevail. And it is, it's a major part of the background to this phenomenon of precarious employment. And then the disappearance of the world of mass production has been fatal to a large part of the middle sections of the job structure. So that's the world that we knew in the 20th century as the stable employment in an automobile factory with the union, with the communities, the good jobs, the good salaries, and so forth. It's that world which is under threat. And so this is the new reality. Institutionally conservative social democracy hasn't mastered it. It has, on the contrary, accepted to a large extent this neoliberal flexibilization, which it then wants to balance by certain social rights. The corporativist, the syndicalist discourse of let's insist on collective bargaining is simply denying the new reality. And so the reality is unmastered. It's traveling on its own logic. That's the dramatic situation. Yes?
I was curious about
Okay, I'm having trouble hearing. Could you speak
Sorry.
louder?
So remote work discussions right now are almost all about jobs in the knowledge economy or jobs in the sort of enterprise that you're discussing. And that discussion then sort of implies that the remainder of the economy is purely domestic. But actually, a large proportion of workers who are migrant workers, who are international workers,
Yes.
who are sending remittances, are in informal or temporary jobs that have them moving countries. And so there's sort of two different sets of policy solutions that you need if you're looking at this more globalized workforce. But if you're looking at purely national level supports, how do you create national level policies that support this sort of growing number of people who are moving internationally, either as part of this Steinberg or as part of this large portion of the international mobile workforce that is in more low-paid informal work, and that then leaves behind the sort of hollowed out middle class, but then becomes purely national. Sorry.
Well, I'm not sure if I followed everything, but it
Sorry.
seemed that there were two aspects to this. So one is the theme in the discussion of globalization, right, which we're going to discuss in the week after next, and there you could say one of the subjects of debate about the direction of globalization is, should we accept a form of globalization that gives the maximum of freedom to things and to money to cross national frontiers, but arrests, imprisons people in the nation state or in blocks of homogeneous nation states like the European Union? In principle, the initiative that has the greatest potential to diminish inequality among countries is advance in the mobility of labor to cross national frontiers. But this advance is extremely dangerous. It's an explosive subject. And in order to be feasible politically and socially, it has to be contained. It has to be advanced in gradual steps on the part of the receiving countries, and it has to involve some element of compensation to the sending countries. So that's, let's say, that's the discussion in globalization. And then in the domestic economy, the question is, what should be done? And that's this discussion about the alternative regime. The alternative labor law regime, what I call the hybrid regime, and the direct legal intervention in the employment relation to master the new productive reality. Attempting to avoid as much as possible simply shifting the burden on restraints on migration, because that's one of the residual elements of the populist position. That is, the import of unskilled laborers, in fact, is a downward force to the wages of low-skilled workers in the rich economy. So all the parts of this problem work together in some way and complicate each other. That's the reality. Yes.
So I had a question. When you laid out the short-term organized minority section, you were laying out the two solutions and the third sort of synthesis. But there was one factor that seemed to me like you did not emphasize, which was the need for firms to compete effectively between each other for a dynamic economy to emerge, and therefore the need for the interests of capital and labor within an enterprise to be aligned. Particularly in the context of international competition, I can imagine we would want Ford's workers, for example, picking a firm with a large union, to be more loyal to Ford than to GM.
Yes.
And so I'm curious, first of all, how you factor that in, and then, as part of that, how you didn't mention in your account, what I think, or maybe I'm misconceptualizing it, alternative conceptions of labor, such as the GET system, where we're supporting workers through giving them training, benefits, or social services, or a works council style representation that seems to merge the decision making between workers and management while still keeping enterprises aligned with each other vis-a-vis other enterprises.
Well, so I think that when I was discussing the broader political scope or agenda of what I call the hybrid regime, I'm thinking that it is interested in things like that, worker representation in the corporation. However, I want to go back to the initial part of your statement about the alignment of the interests of workers and firms. So that did figure in my discourse, but it figured in the opposite way to the way in which you're raising that. I said, the problem is that the interests of workers and the firms is aligned. That's the problem in the richest firms, in the most capital-intensive firms. Their interests are aligned against the interests of everyone else. That's the problem that we address through these alternatives to the corporatist regime and to the collective bargaining regime. The wage bill is a relatively minor part of the enterprise. So Microsoft, the managers and the workers are more or less the same thing. And they're all part of this privileged minority. So I don't think we have to worry about that. We have to worry about the alignment, not about the disalignment.
If I can just come in
Yes.
here for a second. I mean, I think if the issue is that a lot of the discussions on the relationship between labor and capital at the present time is informed by the kind of decline in the bargaining power of labor in the last 4 decades, the decline in the regulation and standards in the labor markets, where you've had this long period of stagnation, in particular sort of male worker wages in the face of growing productivity. So the sense that the benefits of productivity within enterprises has not benefited the workers there. And therefore the need to increase the bargaining power of workers, both through greater representation, unions or works councils, as Mike was saying, or through sort of national standards and regulation of labor markets. And that way of looking at it puts the picture now after 40 years of decline in bargaining power mainly as a question of giving workers enough power to demand and receive their share of the enterprise surplus. And therefore necessarily as a kind of a relationship between labor and capital that's antagonistic. That way of thinking about it is one where there is essentially a kind of, we don't worry about overall productivity. We worry about the fact that what is the primary problem in the relationship between labor and capital today is the weakening of the bargaining power of labor and how to reverse that. And if you look at the problem strictly from that standpoint, the issue of labor capital collaboration or cooperation really becomes very secondary. In fact, it becomes laughable because it's not true that the workers, let's say in Ford and General Motors, have actually benefited from the competitive gains that those firms might have made or increases in productivity. And so the issue is not this, complicity of interest. It's precisely the fact that, the owners of capital and the managers have gone their own way. And the way to reverse that would be through sort of not denying the antagonism, but leveling the playing field in terms of bargaining.
But that's not the main direction which events have taken, I think. I think you can see this in the evolution of social democracy in Europe and its application to the firms. So historical social democracy had as one of its historical principles the defense of insiders against outsiders, and especially of insider workers, these workers who have quasi-tenured jobs, against everyone else. So the main tendency, there's some element of the rearguard defense of these privileges, yes, but that's not the main tendency. The main tendency is to give up, and to give up in return for something else, which is the Scandinavian or Dutch flex security. That is, you say, we'll flexibilize the labor markets, meaning the capitalists can move everyone around. There's less and less distinct restraint in favor of these tenured insiders. But in return, we'll create a package of benefits, of rights, that is separate from the job and universally portable. And that will include, for example, unemployment insurance, rights to skilling, and so forth. That's been the main tendency. So it's been the liberalization of social democracy, sugared, attenuated by this idea. Now, I don't think there's anything wrong with the Scandinavian Dutch idea of flex security. In fact, you could say it's a small example of what I described as this general principle that we want to combine the haven with the storm. But it has been in isolation. In its actual functioning in the evolution of social democracy, it has been a compensation for a retreat rather than an advance to another system. Yes.
So I'm curious about this kind of parallel legal system that we want to.
What I call the hybrid regime.
Yes, for the precariat, essentially, right? So the vast majority of individuals, and so if you look about, so for me, I'm looking at the developing countries and informal sector, and then also maybe tagging on to an earlier question, the migrant who crosses the border and becomes a legal alien, essentially, right? So there's an assumption here that the state is benevolent, and so, you know, in many cases, sometimes the interests of the state and the interests of the worker are antagonistic. In the case of somebody who's crossed the border and is considered illegal, and then is more prone to actually experiencing precarious work, in part because they're not able to, being visible to the state is dangerous to them. Or in the informal sector, in the developing world, where the state's interest is to include them in the informal sector and extract tax rent from them in that regard. So how would you think about, go about kind of empowering these set of workers, where in certain instances the state might not be as benevolent as it wants them to be?
Well, first of all, let me say the hybrid regime is not designed or proposed as a solution to the problem of precarious employment. It came up in a different way. When I was dealing with the organized minority, I said there are two ways of dealing with it, the corporatist and the contractualist. And it may be best to imagine the recombination of these two regimes into a third, for the reasons that I stated. I then raised at the end of that discussion the question, might this hybrid regime not have advantages that go beyond the organized minority and help us, in combination with other things, deal with the emergency of precarious employment? That's the way in which it arose. And then in the international section, of course, the idea is that the migrant workers who are accepted into the country must be accepted under this new legal regime of the qualification of labor, so that precarious employment not be a quasi form of slave labor, and they'd be really free. And that's then the point at which the short term and the long term intersect. So I think this is a conundrum in the debate about globalization. We want different countries to be able to continue to compete on the basis of different returns to labor. It's not inherently wrong for labor to be remunerated at different levels in different economies. If the poor economies can't compete on the basis of having a lower wage, they lose one of their main advantages. But at the same time, we want the basis of the world economy to be free labor, and really free labor. And therefore, we must deal with what that implies. And precarious employment, in the absence of countervailing guarantees, is a threat to free labor. So these problems have to be managed together in some way. But the very first step is to recognize the problem, to deal with it in its structural totality, rather than either to insist on the preservation of the 20th century system and to try and outlaw any circumvention of it, or to tear down the walls and accept this so-called flexibility as translated into radical economic insecurity. Those are the alternatives that we have. And the essential basis of the argument is we have to create an alternative to that. And of course, it's remarkable that the left parties, for whom this should be a sacrosanct subject, it's at the very core of their history, of their being, for the most part have no proposal. They have no proposal. Do you think they have this discussion about the contractualist regime and the corporatist regime and the hybrid form and the legal intervention in the employment relation? They don't have any of that. So and this is really shocking. So the failure to have a view of that then puts them in a strategic dilemma. One is to say, let's maintain our privileged historical connection to this constituency. It's a shrinking constituency, but it continues to be important to us. Labor organized in the capital-intensive sectors of the economy. Like the automobile worker in a traditional automobile factory. And so then what do we demand? We demand a few more years for the Rust Belt, for declining mass production, a series of defensive maneuvers to buy some time. That's all it does. And what's the alternative? The alternative is, for the left parties, is to cut their link to this constituency and say, we'll become generic middle-class quality of life parties. We won't have a core constituency. And that's the path that, for the most part, European social democracy has taken. Meanwhile, the Americans are saying the lodestar of all progress is to make the United States like Europe. And Europe is trying to become like the United States. Yes?
On this point, actually, there's this argument that the most disorganized majority right now, with the widest potential for a social base, at least in high-income countries, would be the producers of behavioral data that's being captured as surplus by firms and turned into profit via advertising and surveillance revenues.
Uh-huh.
So there's, in particular, I think it's Jaron Lanier and Glenn Weil have this project in Data Dignity, which has different claims. One of them is recoding behavioral data as property that can only be licensed to firms and can't actually be alienated. And then the second part of it is a system of, or not really system, but a structure of data unions throughout the
Yes.
economy. Do you see this as a project of the reorganization of labor, or is this just...
Well, I think that has mainly to do with the other issue we discussed, of the perverse form of the knowledge economy, of the insular knowledge economy. So the tendency in the United States is to identify the knowledge economy with the platform oligopolies, which are in fact an anomalous corner of the knowledge economy. And one of the presuppositions of the business of the platform oligopolies is they've discovered a way to profit from a loophole in the law of intellectual property, which is the data of their customers is not protected and not remunerated. So they have a business model which is based on trafficking in that loophole. And that's combined with other things like the network effects and so forth. So that's their business. And that's, in principle, very easy to solve. Politically very hard to do, but conceptually very easy to achieve, which is to close this loophole. And there are any number of ways to do it. You described one of them, but there are many others. Yes.
Talk a little bit more about the idea of the capital auction. Just because I found it interesting, but I think you.
Well, because in a way, when we were discussing the knowledge economy, that came up at the end. When we were discussing finance, it came up at the end, and now it comes up at the end. So it's a point of convergence. It's a very fundamental theme. It's hard to develop in detail without changing here the character of our discussion, but so the question is, what does it mean to socialize the means of production? It means that our access to the means of production, rather than being under the cover of this absolute and perpetual property right, is not vested in the state, but is put in some third place, what I'm calling these public trusts that I described. And they then make the productive resources of society available basically to whoever can use them most efficiently and assure the society of the highest rate of return for those resources. So the basic idea is no one owns something forever. They own them so long as they can use them best. And the productive resources of society are shared.
So I had a question about this too, so I'm glad that it came up,
Yes.
although it is sort of at the very latter tail end
at the
of
end
the
of the
discussion.
end, yes.
But
At
I
the
just
end of
want
the
to
horizon.
understand this, so how this is different. I mean, your description of socializing ownership through this sort of public trust is, if one wanted to be snide, would say it was like the communist idea that the state would hold labor's ownership rights in trust. But of course, that didn't end very well.
Yes.
So there's an issue. So there's one question of what that does. What does that really
I think
mean?
that, no, but
I want to bypass
yes.
that because that's not
Yeah.
really my question. But so what does it mean? I mean, so I want to understand what you have in mind with your idea of a capital auction. How would that actually differ from what we have at present, except in the sense that under the present, not everybody can participate in buying up companies or in private equity or in venture capital because they don't have access to resources.
Well, I
so is
said-
the issue, is it that they don't have access to the resources, but otherwise, an advanced capital market like the United States in all of its various forms is effectively providing a version of your continuous auction, because at any point in time you can go and buy everything and anything, including things that have not been created yet. And so it's not like property is being held permanently and so forth. It's always being given to the highest bidder. So in what sense would that be different?
So when this came up before, I said, theoretically, the existing capital market is this capital auction. That's what it's supposed to be. A perfectly competitive capital market is an auction. And it's always going to the most effective users in the long run, supposedly. And so that came up in the privatization debates in Eastern Europe and Russia, when they said it doesn't matter that the oligarchs get the assets first, because in the long run, they'll go to the most efficient users. Now, we have to assess, is that a valid comparison? Because one of the differences between the capital auction and this existing capital market is that under the capital auction, there's no perpetual property right. The person doesn't keep it forever. There are not 1,000 different ways in which he can hire intermediaries to keep his business afloat and so forth. a group credentials itself vis-a-vis these independent trusts. I'm imagining that they're pluralistic and independent of the state, providing assurance of competence and some reason to believe that their thing is going to work, and they get a try at it. So that's quite different from the established regime. Now, when I said that, I said that at the same time, we should maintain in the market order something like the existing unified property right of the 19th century, because that has an advantage that the capital auction doesn't have. And the advantage is allowing a bold entrepreneur to do something that no one else believes in. He doesn't have to negotiate consensus. He doesn't have to persuade anyone. He can do it on his own risk. And so we should have that also. But there's no reason why the market order should be fastened to a single dogmatic version of itself. That's the comment.
I'm still puzzled, but we'll come back to that because there was still, there's somebody over there.
Professor, if I took proper notes, the first defect of the contractualist regime, or the collective bargaining labor law regime, is its tendency to privilege the purely economic aspirations of the workers to the wages and benefits. And in the assigned chapter of your knowledge economy for this class, you address the omnipresent problem of inflation. And I quote you, one of the most constant doctrines of economics has been that returns to labor cannot sustainably increase above the rise in productivity. So I'm curious how this inflation problems relates, or whether it relates with your critics to the defects of the collective bargaining labor law regime and the short-term solutions to reshape the relations between labor and economy, especially like in countries developed.
Well, why? Are you seeing an inflationary consequence? Why would there be an inflation?
I see that there is a relation between your argument of this contractualist regime, like in having this aspiration to increase salaries, as you mentioned, like the third defect of this only have this like this obsession with the monetary aspect of wages, and also at the same time a short-term solution to reshape this relation between labor and employment, and how can we avoid the inflation problem with this? Because you mentioned like in the knowledge economy that this is a problem and we have to deal with this.
But I just don't see the connection to this. So these proposals are, among other things, productivist proposals. That is, they should be seen as part of a productivist project in which the idea is not simply to spend money socially, it's to animate production. And animating production is the basic response to inflation. We produce more efficiently, we produce better. That's the aim.
Maybe I could rephrase my question to, should we be afraid of inflation in this process of creating a hybrid regime that you propose?
No, why? Why? I mean, so under the mainstream orthodox ideas, a decreed rise in the nominal wage is self-defeating. It will undo itself in inflation. But that doesn't mean that an intervention in the powers of labor vis-a-vis capital will undo itself in the same way, because then we could achieve a change in the distribution of the pie without reducing it to its merely nominal effects. We would change the real wage by intervening in the underlying institutional realities. And those labor law regimes that I discussed are such interventions in the underlying institutional realities.
But one of the weaknesses of the traditional collective bargaining based, or the social democratic version of that in Europe, arrangements between capital and labor, was the problem that it was easy for firms to, or not necessarily easy, but firms were all for lack of other options, did give in to wage demands that exceeded labor productivity increases, which were then validated through more expansionary monetary policy and led to this sort of cost push inflation. So one of the reasons the argument goes where inflation disappeared in the world is precisely because labor power dissipated.
Depressed.
And so and so there is a kind of a link. But I think the answer, as you gave it, and I agree with it, is that you want to look at this as a productivist arrangement. And so if I may take a few minutes here, because that's sort of linked to some of the things that I wanted to say, or sort of my twist on this discussion, and let's see how we can, because I think that's the key thing, that I want to start this question on the relationship between labor and capital precisely from a productivist angle. And one rationale is precisely the kind of problem that arises in contexts where this agenda of the relationship between designing the appropriate institution for capital-labor relationship is not explicitly first and foremost productivist, then it ends up becoming one for struggles for distributive shares. Too often leads to a kind of an inflationary cost push, kind of a spiral. In any case, is destructive of a productive environment, the productivist ecosystem. So I want to start from the presumption that if we want to approach the problem of capital and labor relationship from a productivist angle, we want to say that we want to start from a kind of a capital-labor relationship that is cooperative, that is collaborative, that is not antagonistic, that is not based on the idea that there is a fixed share and the more I get, the less you get. It's important to have this relationship be collaborative because the kinds of things that create productivity are the things that are going to require collaboration. You want firms to invest in technologies that are appropriate for their workers, to invest in training. You want firms, we want workers to be loyal to their firms, to invest in long-term relationships, to feel pride in what they were doing, invest effort, and so forth, and feel enough security that they can invest in this bilateral relation. So it seems to me that we have to start from a relationship that we want this relationship to be collaborative, not antagonistic, and based on sort of let's just get the bargaining right. Now, there are, I think, two classes of things that, and I think everything that we've said in this course in terms of how to construct that a productivist economy is either explicitly or implicitly based on sort of labor and capital collaborating in the service of this higher productivity economy. Now, there are two classes of circumstances where things could go wrong. One is, of course, that you can have a relationship that produces the productivity that you want, but it's essentially one that's based on very unequal bargaining powers. And then, in particular, capital and employers and managers have too much bargaining power. And therefore, to the extent that you do get the productivity benefits one way or another, labor doesn't get its share. It seems to me that the last 30, 40 years has been precisely played out in exactly that way, with the caveat that I think as labor-capital relationships have turned antagonistic, I think the overall productivity path has also become less dynamic than it could have been. So part of the reason why I think the productivity is not expanding as rapidly as it did in the 50s and 60s is precisely that this relationship is not as collaborative as could be. But leaving that aside, clearly, the bargaining issues is one major area where this relationship, even if you have collaboration, it could be that the distributive outcomes is not going to be inclusive. Now, bargaining issues are going to be related to both sort of regulations with respect to labor organizations, to possibilities of unions, national labor standard, and also very importantly, a question that came out a couple of instances is the ability of firms or capital to exit. So globalization feeds directly into this question of unequal bargaining power, and that has clearly played a role. So in that context, you have to sort of take into account not just national regulations, but also the global context and the ability of the exit option that globalization provides firms as a fundamental shaping of this bargaining environment. The second set of things that could go wrong is that collaboration can end up collusion against other groups and other interests in society, as you've mentioned. So then you can get a kind of a labor aristocracy in the midst of a precarious sort of majority of laborers. You can have large monopolies, sort of the platform companies where, the workers are perfectly happy, perhaps, colluding with their managers, but everybody else in the economy is being exploited. You can have workers colluding with their managers to exploit the environment. So there's no reason that this collusion is going to essentially produce socially and environmentally sustainable and beneficial outcomes. So in other words, there are sort of reasons to worry that the collusion, that the collaboration might produce negative externalities for the rest of the economy, adverse externalizing effects. So it seems to me that if we want to put this discussion on the relation between capital and labor in the context of our sort of overall productivist frame, we want to say that we want particular remedies, particular institutional arrangements that are going to address these two critical weaknesses. One is issues with respect to bargaining power, the other with respect to issues of adverse externalities, externalizing effects of collusion or collaboration, of what would then look like collusion between labor and capital in the advanced sectors. Now, how would we address these failings? I think there's, I would put sort of the way that, my version of your story would be to think of a kind of a three-level architecture of policies or solutions. One is the first fundamental level is a kind of sort of a set of national level of standards, right? So that could be a national minimum wage, that could be national rules on collective bargaining, it could be national rules on benefits, on paid vacations, holidays, and those kinds of things in general with respect to labor rights, organization, and benefits. So there's a kind of a minimal, there's a floor that is sort of national regulation set. Then there is a kind of a second level where you provide significant room and autonomy for different localities and perhaps different industries to experiment with alternative set of institutional arrangements. So you can have different varieties of local, regional, or sectoral collaborative arrangements. And that might, range from, various types of corporativist arrangements locally to sectoral wage boards or sectoral agreements on work that are, however, have to be on top of the sort of the national minimum and not as exemptions from that. So a significant amount of room and autonomy to experiment above and beyond the national standards, both at the sectoral level and also at the sort of regional level. Third, I think we need to think in a kind of a economy, in a world that one way or another that's going to be open to trade and commerce and direct investment. We need to be concerned about how we address threats of firm exit. And I think because if you imagine this architecture where nations have a variety of requirements and standards, and then on top, localities want to build even higher arrangements or want to experiment with different ones. How do we prevent in that kind of an architecture individual firms will simply saying, well, screw you, I'm just going to another country where I don't have to have any of those requirements. And so we need to consider that. Now, we might talk about some ideas on that in a couple of weeks when we talk about globalization in particular. We might talk about the potential for things like social anti-dumping standards that you will mean, that trade rules, for example, or investment rules do not allow imports from jurisdictions where labor standards or working conditions or bargaining rights are very significantly violated, and therefore to provide a kind of a protection, not for protection sphere, but to ensure that domestic standards are not undermined through international trade or international investment. Sort of that might be sort of one way to think about it at the national level. It's harder to think what their equivalents would be sort of when there are differences regionally or locally in terms of standards, because those would all have to be within a nation. You don't want to violate the interstate commerce clause of the Constitution and things like that. But ultimately, I think, and this is where I come back to the productivist, I think the only sustainable remedy against the worry that higher requirements, higher standards, and higher wages or better jobs for workers would not be undermined through this threat of exit through globalization is to ensure that those higher standards and regulations and wages are underpinned by high productivity, right? Then it doesn't become an issue because, as the old story goes, Swedish firms didn't particularly care that they were paying very high taxes because in return they were getting all the public infrastructure, productivity enhancing benefits of a very big state. So the quid pro quo there is that yes, there are these requirements and that firms are subjected to, but in return they're getting public services, public inputs, and the state agencies' contributions towards a productive ecosystem, which is what makes them and keeps them productive in the first place. It seems to me that that's really the only reliable, long-term, sustainable remedy against this threat of exit from these high-standard, high-demanding regulatory regimes, which is sort of why I think we come right back to our starting point, which is that we need to start from a productivist standpoint of thinking how you get this collaboration, how this in turn produces high productivity, and that becomes its own defense against sort of exit of firms and managers. So this would be how sort of I would frame it in a way that also sort of links with some of the discussion on globalization.
Well, just a footnote to one of your propositions. So cooperation between capital and labor is beneficial to the extent that it's inclusive. So if it's fragmentary, then it's much more likely to represent this perverse collusion to which you referred.
Well, I think those are, I think the perversion could come both on account of, unequal bargaining powers, so that I'm able to extract most of the productivity benefits that your collaboration with me produces. But the second one also is that we're equally sharing in the benefits,
exactly.
but we're externalizing all the costs to the rest of society. But those seems to me to be conceptually different sources of failure.
So you could make like a very simple hierarchy and say, the best system is a system of universal cooperation. The second best is a system of universal conflict. And the worst is cooperation in the vanguard and conflict everywhere else. That's what we have. And just one more footnote to your thing going back to the capital auction.
Well, before you add that footnote, I have to say, so your second best was a system of universal conflict,
yes,
which is precisely the perfectly competitive market economy benchmark, and why these issues of capital and labor collaboration doesn't come up in that perfectly competitive benchmark, because in that perfectly competitive benchmark, sort of the capital doesn't have any ability to exploit workers, because capital is as atomistic as workers are. And you only have to worry in the theory of the firm about managerial autonomy to the extent that managers don't represent the interests of the shareholders. Then the whole issue of institutional design in that world is really how do you align the incentives of managers with the incentives of the firm's owners, and therefore you got all this sort of arrangements about sort of appropriate incentives, stock ownership, and sort of but all of that is based on a set of background assumptions, which is you have an atomistic capital market, atomistic workers, perfect competition, and perfect capital markets that are very sort of forward-looking.
But that leads to the second footnote, which goes back to the discussion we began about the difference between the capital auction and the existing regime. It's basically very simple. The capital auction is describing a world without capitalists. There's capital, but there's no capitalists. In the existing system, capital goes together with capitalists. Now that's a formidable distinction.
So why is that? So you've just described market socialism as well.
Well, if you market socialism, who knows what that is? But it's yes.
I have a follow-up question right on the capital
Yeah.
auction. I can legitimate this whole return to this topic by also resorting to the popular sovereignty of the undergrads who are fascinated by this idea. But I wonder if there is in terms of capital and social relation, what would be the kind of governance or the prudential judgment look like when the society as a whole, the public sphere, not the government, as I think as Professor Unger insists, it's not going to be the government deciding that this is going to be beneficial, like the military technology is going to be beneficial, therefore investing in is going to be a public sphere altogether judging that this is something socially desirable, and therefore we are investing it, and it's also generating maximal returns, right? This is what the market would have achieved in maximal efficiency. But in terms of the democratic governance of the committee or the group of people who will be deciding on which one to invest and which one doesn't, which one's not, what would it look like, and what would be the people? Who would be the people, and what if they have different normative frameworks and different judgments of what is socially desirable? And Professor Rogers alluded to collusion when it comes to externalities such as pollution. So what if one group of people on that committee or a convention, Convention Generale, decide that there is one way of generating maximal profit, return on the capital, and therefore you're the most efficient user of this capital, and the other group saying this is, it has some kind of detrimental effect on the species of fish
Sure.
to die out, and another group yet, deciding we should go back to some kind of religious norms. So what is going to be the kind of...
No, I think these are, first of all, these are primarily productivist instruments. So the fundamental question is how do we animate production? And the fundamental response is decentralized and experimentalist. So we have a bunch of different trusts. We have people managing it who have different conjectures about what would work. And who then makes the ultimate decision? We have to assume that the democratic institutions are observing this, and they're deciding, they're evaluating after the fact what works, what doesn't work, what has benefits, what has detriments. We'll promote this, we'll suppress that. So rather than a system of direct allocation by the government, there's the experimental post facto observation by the democratic institutions of the doings of these capital trusts. That's the basic scheme I'm imagining.
I'm confused. I thought that the capital was being given out at every point. It was being auctioned to the highest bidder.
It was being lent out.
To the highest bidder.
It was being, in a sense, to the highest bidder, but it's not that someone is buying in perpetuity those capital resources. Someone is borrowing them.
With the best idea, yes.
With claiming to have the best idea. Well, that's what I'm saying, that these different trusts, like different venture capitalists, like different private equity funds, are making different bets on what's good, on what works, on who's reliable. And the solution is amplification, pluralism, experimentalism, many different attempts. And who is watching all of this from the sky? The democratic institutions. So they're accountable.
So I'm sorry, I just have to come back on this because I thought I understood what the capital auction was.
Yes.
That this was actually, there was a market system that people were
No,
bidding.
you were the one who said it was the same.
No, but then you didn't disagree. You didn't, but you
I
said this
I
is
said
how the
this
market.
Yes, no, this is a market. This is a reconstruction of the market order. And so the question is,
I'm sorry. So there are two systems, right? One, you can bid, and whoever is bidding the highest, you have borrows it, and the only institutional constraint you have to worry about how do you keep the managers of these trusts sufficiently distant from the politicians, and that they're actually controlled, that they're not engaged
And from their
that
clients, yes.
insider dealing. Exactly. So that becomes the only. Then there is the one that Hansong is talking about, where people are. Then it's the venture capital idea. People are coming. The venture capitalists. They're not, bidding for the venture capitalist money. They're just coming up with ideas, and then there's a committee of venture capitalists that sit together and decide where they're going to actually
That's right.
allocate their funds.
that's right.
So which model is it? Is it, or
Well,
maybe?
I understand. The venture capitalist owns whatever resources he owns in principle in perpetuity until he loses them. I'm describing a system in which no one owns the fundamental means of production in perpetuity. They belong to society.
I mean, okay.
I mean,
Questions?
it's not, they're,
Inheritance tax, so we get a lot of money from dying people.
no, we don't get a lot of money from dying people. We should, but we don't, yeah.
But according to your proposal,
Yes,
it's
yes.
inheritance tax, so we do have a lot of socially owned money.
Yeah, so one of the implications of this system is that under the system that I described, the basic form of public finance would cease to be taxation. There are certain taxes that we would still impose for reasons of redistribution, like the inheritance tax or the individualized consumption tax. But the basic way of financing the state is by the underlying rate of interest, which is the threshold rate of return for the use of these capital resources. We don't need taxation. Yes, you.
Sorry.
I think I'm also still struggling with capital auction, so I'm going to build on this.
But this is all very unfair. I mean, this is at the end of the horizon, and you're just focusing on the end of the horizon.
It seems to be a very central theme of how.
Yes, I understand. But it's central for a reason, right? I mean, this goes back to the Marxist theme. The question is the means of production. Who controls them?
So on that, in my mind, initially when I was thinking of an auction, in terms of means of production, I was thinking of maybe a tractor that's used in an agrarian setting, and various farmers can
Yes.
buy it or can borrow this tractor.
Cooperative competition, which happened in the 19th century.
But many forms of productive capital are not machines that are easily transferred
Correct.
across firms. They're sunk cost investments in
Money,
one type of
yeah.
production, if it's even manufacturing. So in that sense, physical capital doesn't necessarily lend itself to an auction system where it can move.
No, of course not.
Fungible, right?
No,
It's
so, and
essentially money.
most capital would be liquid, yes.
And so in that system, then I'm back to the question of is it a top-down VC type lending where there's some set of people that are making decisions and allocating this capital, and then how would that come back to the fund, so to speak? Normally VC firms at some point exit, and that's how they realize their gains, and then they have the money back to give it back. But if there's only a public institution and nothing
nothing else. There's nowhere to exit to. So then, in my mind, it's only state-owned enterprises, essentially.
State-owned enterprise, why?
Well, because
I
there's
mean,
only one public
no,
fund.
no. There are many funds, and you're saying the capital auction is permanent in the sense that there are a bunch of people who are saying, I can do much better than these people are doing. I can give you much more than they're giving you. And that has to be evaluated. That's some deliberative process. But it is a quasi-market process. You borrowed the capital, and you're using it to a certain productive use. And periodically or constantly, there are other people saying, no, don't give it to them, give it to me. I can do much better than they can.
Okay, so you're the auctionist in some shape or form, and I'm a firm. So I
Yes.
take a chunk of money from you and I invest it into a factory.
So, and normally you say, 4 years from now, come back and let's see what happened. Or, and then 4 years from now, a bunch of people saying, don't renew them, don't renew your loan to them, give it to me, I can do much better. Look at what they've done. They've done all these stupid things. So that's the kind of process that's happening.
So the original factory would then be liquidated?
What?
The original factory
It might
would be
be
liquidated.
taken over, it might be turned around, restructured, whatever, depending on the circumstance. I think the fundamental difference here is this question of who's the boss? You know, is there a class of capitalists who control the means of production and who, in the name of the right of property, decide how the productive assets of society will be used? Now, then the problem with state socialism is that there's the state. So, but the state ends up being a committee of people. I'm imagining a different system in which there are funds, experimental funds, a great diversity of different agents for this activity, all of them having this character of representing the abstract interests of society through different productivist strategies. And they are accountable to the democratic institutions, who over the long haul determine what's good, what's bad, what works, and what doesn't.
I mean, let me just...
I don't think that's paradoxical.
I mean, the two issues that... I mean, I think you're trying to solve too many things with something that doesn't seem very, very practicable. I mean, one issue is just access to capital. Who actually get access to capital
Yes.
so that they can deploy it in the direction, whatever direction they seem is most worthwhile. That's an issue of democratizing capital. And it seems to me that you know, the more direct ways of addressing that issue is through some combination of an inheritance tax and a wealth tax. That's a, you know, it's a finding ways of periodically reshuffling the capital stock. So that's one issue. The other issue is how do we ensure that capital is used in directions that society, as judged by its stewards, value, but in ways that the market, as it's currently constituted, doesn't value. And that's an argument for establishing a number of public venture funds that are going to operate in a direction of making these longer-term investments in a number of different areas. But it seems to me that you need sort of a liquid, private, sort of, you know, ordinary capital market to operate alongside those public venture funds as well.
I agree with you that this regime that I discussed is the idealized extension of a long series of intermediate steps, including the ones you just described. But I'm just imagining, what would it mean to extend them to the limit, to put it to the limiting case?
Well, because in the limit you have no, you know, if you don't have a private capital market, then you don't have any kind of a benchmark. of value against which and then it becomes a bunch of committees making
No, you
allocation
might- no,
decisions.
you might well have some capital market because these enterprises all have limited lives. They're restructured. They're turned into one another. There can be some market in which they are valued and traded for one another. That's not excluded, but I'm simply imagining. So your basic idea about the short term is we democratize access, for example, to credit through development banks, through public venture capital funds, and so forth. I'm just saying, imagine the idealized extension of that to its final conclusions. That's a world in which there is capital. Capital is auctioned off, it's used, but there are no capitalists. And there's nothing contradictory about that idea. It's just hard to imagine the concrete development
when
of
you
all
say
of its
there are no
implications.
capitalists, you mean there are no, everybody's a temporary capitalist.
Because the fundamental means of production, I'm not talking about little property, but the basic means of production are not eternally owned by anyone, cannot be alienated, cannot be transmitted in a hereditary form. Nevertheless, they don't belong to the state. They are divisible and transferable, but not by this class of perpetual owners.
Okay. Should we take some questions from people who haven't spoken before? Yeah, Alex?
Hey, I'm not sure if I'm understanding this right, but, Professor, is the way that you're imagining this kind of like a DARPA or like an ARPA-E kind of model where essentially you have like public ownership of some kind of capital stock, not necessarily exclusive of, the rest of the venture capital of whatever
Yes.
investing industry, but there's a kind of like societally benefit, societally targeted kind of goal for this specific fund, or maybe just like a diversification of that, so it's not just like defense and energy, but like investing in different models of, I don't know, worker organization within a business unit or whatever. Is this kind of the theme that you're thinking of, where there's like a social goal for like a diversity of funds,
Well,
not necessarily owned by the investors in their traditional market set of like, the goal isn't to take over the factory when it fails. The goal is to try to promote this innovation in these specific industries. I think we're all kind of trying to understand.
yeah, you're focusing on the intermediate steps. So you're like DARPA and so forth. You mentioned, and that's perfectly legitimate. I'm simply saying, imagine the generalization and the extension to this. Moreover, I think the natural tendency, which Danny introduced and you continued, is to imagine this as some kind of social correction of the market. The market isn't paying attention to our social aims, or externalities, positive externalities. I'm not caring so much about social aims. My fundamental emphasis is on production. So Karl Marx says, capitalism is relentless accumulation, relentless innovation. Everything turns into everything else. That's what I want also. And
So
I'm not worried about sugarcoating this with a layer of pietistic concessions to social interests. I just want the maximum of innovation, of wealth, of accumulation.
So it does sound like it's along the same lines, maybe even a little more prescribed than I think what some of us are imagining. Not trying to take over the entire capital market with this type of fund. It's really specifically addressing productivist issues within.
No, now you've reduced it because now you say it's like just an incident. It's like a public venture capital fund. No, it's not like a public venture capital. Public venture capital funds are useful in this intermediate step, but there's something that's not an intermediate step that is the ultimate radical and general extension of a principle. That's this.
I'll be happy when we get to the intermediate stage and happy to stop there. Yep.
Would it be fair to say that the difference then, like maybe this will clarify things, maybe it won't, between the idea idea is that in the market, property gives, when there's a project, there's a going concern that's currently happening, and there's someone else who thinks they can do it better and has a credible claim to that.
Yes.
There's a right that needs to be allocated, and it's who gets to take control of the going concern moving forward.
Yes.
And in the property basis, it goes to the incumbent, and in the capital auction, it goes to the credible claimant.
Yes. Absolutely.
I mean, the person was just renting the capital, so it doesn't make any difference. It's the same as if it was owning, because if he's renting it for 4 years, somebody wants to take over it, 2 years into the term,
Sure.
then he would have to buy out the rest of the ownership. So it's sort of like the same. There's no difference. Anyhow, yeah.
So my question is about that, like, so one person is going to come up and say that I'm going to make this money like valuable. I'm going to create a value in 4 years, which would require a competency, like in terms of like finance.
Yes, of course.
So like we discussed like earlier in class that like that sort of competency is actually one of the underlying causes for inequality in the society. So isn't this system also like going to tilt toward people who have like this advantage in their background?
This is not a solution to all problems of society. There's a hierarchy of talents in society and a hierarchy of competences. I'm not imagining that the capital auction is a solution to the problems generated by that hierarchy. But we are, through this device, eliminating a series of powerful obstacles to the generalization of innovation and productivity.
But in your longer term agenda was also the changes in the educational system, for example, that would begin to countervail them.
So this is not the be-all and end-all of a progressive project. This is one element, and this is a solution to one problem. And so there's the transformation of democratic politics, because the existing low-energy democracies would be a poor basis for this productivist alternative. A radically different form of education. I'm imagining an education in which everything is taught twice from contrasting points of view. It forms different people who are resistant to the orthodoxies of the universities, and so forth. So it's in that setting. So then Danny Roderick comes and says, but that's a system. And it's a mountain that's too tall to climb. And I say, no, it's not. It's not a system. It's a structure. The different parts reinforce each other. They limit each other. But they're not an indivisible package that we have on an all or nothing basis.
So at the beginning of this class, I told you I was worried that we were agreeing too much, and that we weren't serving the goals of education by providing sufficiently dissimilar perspectives. But I think we're trying to get a little bit better at that. Okay, see you on Monday. Next week we're talking about the climate transition.
It's interesting that
This question arises with a lot of interest.
Yes, I see. I'm impressed by it. I'll take that to heart. It deserves development. Yes?
I wanted to offer, I heard at the beginning talking about the climate class and that.
Yes.
There's I don't know if you've heard about a new paper called Reconsidering Reparations by Olufemi Taiwo. It takes,
Send me an email.
I'll send you an email, yeah. It
Okay.
takes a view of the climate project as being a question of building a particular world in politics. Links it to the question of racial reparations, and basically you can't do climate without linking local and digital concerns in a project or world building. So I figured,
Good. Great. Hello. Yes, we can go back to my office. I just have to stop along the way at the bathroom. Oh, I forgot here my microphone. Where's that?